Welcome to the Turnaround Podcast with your host, Stephen Phillips. In each episode, Stephen speaks to experienced practitioners who discuss their careers, key moments, challenges, and lessons learned in financial turnarounds and business restructuring. Join us as we unravel the secrets to turning struggling businesses into success stories. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, frylibertas.com. Now, here's the host of the Turnaround Podcast, Stephen Phillips.
I'm delighted to welcome Tony Groom to the show. Tony is an investor who backs struggling SMEs that have intangible assets and unique qualities that customers need but are difficult to value. Tony founded K2 Partners, a small turnaround firm of 5 turnaround professionals who act as advisors and or directors to implement their triage and fundamental change approach to consensual restructuring for insolvent companies. Tony is a certified turnaround professional, accredited by the European Association of Turnaround Certified Turnaround Professionals. Tony has over 30 years of experience of rescuing insolvent companies and restoring them to solvency. Now, whilst exploring Tony's LinkedIn profile, I came across a great testimonial that made me pause. It read, "He is good and he cares." It got me wondering, what has Tony done to deserve that praise? Today, we get to sit down with Tony, dig into the stories, the values, and the moments that earned him such a great endorsement. Tony, welcome to the Turnaround Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Stephen.
Well, I love that heartfelt story. Endorsement, I should say. So I'm going to sort of go back into your history a little bit, as I do with all the guests, just to try and work out how sort of you tick and what your career overview is so far. Can you just give us a little bit of a thumbnail background about yourself?
I suspect the origin really is my roots coming from a service family, and with a grandfather, a father who served in the army. It was sort of very easy at the age of 15 to be persuaded that I'd follow in their footsteps, and the prospect of doing a degree while I was in the army, which was sold to me on the lines that during the degree I had to do a month's service every year, sailing counted. It was very easy for me to find myself leaving school, going straight to Sandhurst, and possibly learning the origin of the values that I'd been brought up with, which was essentially the Sandhurst motto, serve to lead, the concept of the inverted pyramid, where if you're a leader, actually you're serving others, and your whole role in life is to support and have their back.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So you, how many years were you in the army? I should ask.
Well, I was in the army for 12 years. Yeah. I discovered money. I ran a business for the last 4 of them. Yes, I played the game, and I was a soldier. But the fact of the matter is I realised after a few years that everyone else was going to the city in the early 80s. So it was time to go and find some excitement, because being in the army, there was little adventure at the time.
Yes. And so you had started a business in the army, which is quite unusual. I don't think I know too many officers doing that. But how did you then sort of segue from that business into the world of turnaround?
So I was fortunate when I actually left the army. The business was doing quite well. Still own it, ADC Services, but we no longer clean offices and premises in London. I'm not sure I was particularly popular as an army officer with a cleaning company, but what it meant was, when I left the army, I went straight off to London Business School and did a 9-month course. It's like a sort of a Sloan course. It was it gave me a foundation of business. And although while I was in the army, I'd qualified as a service funds accountant, which was essentially a course to train you to run accounts in the army, and also I'd done a postgraduate diploma of marketing, all in an attempt to sort of learn a bit about business. But going to London Business School for 9 months really gave me a foundation, and so the segue into turnaround was my accountant. The accountant for my business used to proofread my case studies at business school, and at the time I didn't know, but he was sort of preparing to leave accountancy and become an insolvency practitioner. So he persuaded me that actually I shouldn't do what I wanted to do, which was, help businesses develop, grow, raise money, list on what was OFX at the time, with a view to taking stakes in businesses that were growing. He suggested that most of them failed and that what I should do is become a company doctor. He'd become an insolvency practitioner, and we learned about insolvency. And so we spent the next 10 years learning about insolvency. And although he's not part of K2, we still do business together. And it was really my inspiration to become a company doctor, as was, with a view to actually ending up owning companies that we turned around.
Yeah, and were there any sort of early deals or specific moments that made you think, "Oh, right, I'm on the right course here. I really love this"?
Well, the segue was really very much to move from basically being a manager of insolvent companies, and I benefited hugely from having advice from insolvency practitioners very early on and learning about insolvency. But really, it was very much a fee approach, which is the traditional approach to making money out of insolvency. And so the revelation was more, actually, what I should be doing is investing in and buying companies to turn around to build a portfolio of companies. So after 10 years working as a company doctor, I set up K2, and we sort of built a team of like-minded people who wanted to take equity in companies.
Yes. And we'll leave the army behind now, but apart from, it does occur to me that there probably were lessons about that you got in your army career that you're probably still applying now. Is there anything that sort of jumps to mind when you think of what you learned and how you still apply some of those lessons?
Well, I mentioned the motto at Sandhurst, serve to lead. The fact of the matter is to succeed as an army officer, you've got to recognise that actually your job is to take responsibility, take the blame if things go wrong. The soldiers, in particular senior NCOs, are far more experienced than young officers. And I learned very early on that actually you took their advice, and if anything went wrong, you took the blame. And that was how it worked. And if you did that, they would follow you as a leader, but at the end of the day, you listened to them for advice and you followed it. And in the world of insolvency in particular, but business, a lot of it's about actually taking responsibility for your actions. And I suppose as much as anything else is taking decisions. And I think we might come on to distinguishing between advisors and investors, owners. It is about making decisions, not advising others to make decisions. It's about taking responsibility for those decisions and implementing them.
I mean, that resonates with me. I think the other thing that I would say when you're in a restructuring scenario, particularly, if you're in an advisory team, I found often in big firms, a lot of lawyers, a lot of professionals, they like their very specific thing that they're doing, and they're very good at that, whether that's employment or tax or whatever it is. And it feels to me that any project needs a leader who's like the polyfiller, who's basically where there is a problem and stuff is oozing out, and you need to be the person who's actually solving that problem, going to the problem, not necessarily I will only deal with a specific situation. Does that resonate with you, that thought?
I mean, it does. It's an interesting notion because leadership is a much discussed topic, and you could argue that crisis leadership is very different to the sort of more consensual, nurturing sort of leadership when there isn't a crisis. At the end of the day, at the end of the day, this notion of taking responsibility is different from, it's real leadership, basically. And while we all want to nurture others and encourage them and empower them and all the rest of it, at the end of the day, the buck's got to stop somewhere. And you talk about lawyers. One of the difficulties with turnaround in particular is it's entirely appropriate for a lawyer to tell you what the law is, but it's a very different thing for them to actually make the decision or interpret the pros and cons. They need to explain the pros and cons. This is the difference, I think, between the advisors and lawyers, and indeed many insolvency practitioners who are advising. At the end of the day, someone's got to make a decision, stand by it, and you cannot make a perfect decision. And this is where turnaround is all about making lots of decisions, and they're often a weighted decision, let's say an 80% decision early, that's far better off than putting off a decision to get a 100% decision that's too late. And so turnaround, in my view, is making lots of decisions, or making decisions and implementing them, and you can spend a long time seeking advice and trying to get to the right answer, but you don't have the time, and that's the difference, I think.
That's interesting. I think one of the observations I would make, and one of the reasons I've been drawn to this area, I think, is in many areas of the law professional practice, you tend to have a particular skill which you are repeating time in, time out, and you're getting instructions often. It's like, document this loan, etc. Whereas I think with restructuring, turnaround, there tends to be a bit of chaos, and you tend to actually have to give a lot more leadership as a professional than perhaps you would do where you're effectively executing other people's deals. That's something that I've really enjoyed, and it seems to me that you probably have enjoyed the leadership role. I mean, that's something you've had a lot of training for as a background, and I get the sense that coming in there, and helping restore order really appeals to you.
Very much so. Look, I think the phrase you used earlier is I care, because I think as a leader, you actually have to like people and you have to care. And I think there are all too many psychopaths running companies who don't care. And this is why it's not about the money. Actually, it's about the reputation, the satisfaction, the pride. It's not about popularity either. It's about self-respect first, and then respecting others. And this is where, to a certain extent, the industry has changed enormously, because insolvency practitioners used to be pretty autonomous and used to have a lot of support from industry. But now, because there's so much compliance and there's a desire to blame people, a lot of insolvency practitioners, unfortunately, have become, checkbox sort of monitors. They're having to account for things. They're having to sort of account for their actions and decisions, and they're often going to lay off responsibility, for instance, for drafting documents to lawyers or selling assets to asset valuers, because they're going to be scrutinized after the event for their decision. This is the difficulty with turnaround, is you're in the teeth of a situation. You've got to make decisions there and then. And in the back of your mind, you probably know you're going to be held to account someday. And I suppose it's a bit like soldiers on a battlefield that are now being taken to court for actions 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. That's another subject that we could discuss.
It is related. You're going to be held to account after the event. It's a real problem.
Yeah. Well, let's get in a little bit to the specifics of K2 and what you do. How do you attract business? That's one question, and really, what is the business model? Let's start with the business model.
So, because we generally deal with small companies, small companies cannot afford the sort of professional fees that large companies command and justify. And the skills necessary, I would argue, for insolvency, take about 10 years to learn. And those, for instance, who've passed the Joint Insolvency Examination Board as an insolvency practitioner, they've normally got 10 years experience under their belt and deserve to earn decent fees. However, the problem with small companies is they can't afford to pay them. So our model is essentially a success-based model, in that we expect to be paid properly, yes, but out of the success we expect to deliver. So the model then requires us to define quite early on what we can realistically achieve. What is success? Which is why we avoid insolvency, because insolvency, quite rightly, it should be administered by licensed insolvency practitioners, and there's no real success. It's just a realization of assets. Whereas we're looking to save a business, and we expect to be paid either a fee, like a success fee, which they often can't afford as a lump sum. So we expect to be paid a success fee over a period of time, or equity. And we particularly want to be part of the future. So we like the idea that the success fee includes a level of monitoring, staying in touch, or the equity involves us helping grow a business.
Yes. How do you avoid the insolvency process? I mean, a lot of current practice in a way is if something's really dire, often there's a sort of, particularly in the smaller situation, you do a pre-pack sale out of an administration process. That's sort of the cookie cutter approach. What are the tools are you using, and what are the strategies you're using to avoid insolvency?
So I would argue that if the business is going to survive, then we use the language of business and company interchangeably. If the business is going to survive, why shouldn't the company survive? Because the pre-pack approach entirely is entirely justified, because the insolvency practitioner cannot get involved in turning around the company, because if it went wrong, they'll be held liable. So it's entirely natural that they would argue a pre-pack is clean, efficient, and a quick way of getting rid of all the liabilities. I would argue they're just stuffing creditors. I would argue much more important, in my view, is to work with creditors for mutual benefit of the future business, whereas a pre-pack just gets rid of creditors and allows the business to continue. Part of me says there should be an element of holding the incumbent owners and directors to the fire so that they make a contribution to creditors out of the future. So I personally prefer using a restructuring plan or a company voluntary arrangement to a pre-pack. There is another consideration with a pre-pack, is that with a pre-pack, you have to find the money to buy the assets, and you have to find the money to fund the trading. Whereas with a CVA, you get to keep the assets, and therefore, providing and subject to creditor support, you actually can use the assets to essentially turn the business round.
And it's worth, just for the viewers who are not that familiar, CVA it is a process that really can only change the liability structure of unsecured rather than secured. But presumably in a small situation, probably what you're doing is talking to the bank directly. There's only one bank, it's not hundreds of creditors. So you can have that conversation with a bank, presumably. And if there's a lot of unsecureds, that is something that the voluntary arrangement, the CVA, can deal with. And presumably that's not that court-intensive process. Therefore, it's probably cheaper to do than some of the other processes we're talking about.
A company voluntary arrangement, it was a great tool. The challenge now is that since the Corporate Insolvency Governance Act, basically 2020, the company voluntary arrangement is less common and more difficult to put in place, because essentially preference, HMRC preference has to
Yes.
be acknowledged. But you mentioned unsecured creditors and secured creditors. The fact of the matter is, I think this is where there's a distinction between our approach. We believe all of these are consensual. We need the support of creditors. And if it's the bank, fine. And if the bank is secured, the reality is if there's sufficient money for the bank to be paid in a formal insolvency procedure, then their interest should be understood and delivered. If, however, as is not uncommon, they have an unsecured position, or there are a lack of assets to pay them out, I believe, and I, have the conversation with the bank to treat some of their liability as unsecured, for them to write down their liability to a level that the company can afford, if that makes sense.
Yes. The interesting question to me is when you're dealing with a big UK clearer, the amounts of money for them aren't life-threatening by any sense of the imagination. So, do you find that they're open to those conversations?
I've just crammed down a secured creditor that was owed £350,000. They were realistic enough to recognise that they were better off taking a lump sum, £25,000 up front.
Yes.
And K2 bought their debt for 25 grand.
Yeah.
And that secured the turnaround of a company.
Well, that's in some ways brilliant to hear, that the clearers are, commercial and flexible, and there's a phone, they answer the phones, and you found that generally that is the case.
I won't say generally, and that particularly, that was a secondary lender. It wasn't a first tier bank. But what I'm really saying is that consensual restructuring, going to have a chat with people, with creditors, treating them with respect, and also helping them understand that they get paid before we do. This is a big change. We're not in the waterfall for payments. So our a really powerful message is, if it doesn't work, we don't get paid.
Yes.
So this particular situation, we this is a company we acquired and turned around 2 years ago. It took me 18 months, by the way, to negotiate with a secured credit, but we turned around 2 years ago. We haven't been paid by the company for 2 years, but we believe in the business. We have shares in the business, and that's our return if we can make it work.
So your business model is, in certain circumstances, you will get shares instead of cash, or
shares or deferred payments. So sometimes a lot of owners don't want us as shareholders, and equally we don't want to be shareholders. So we're happy to take a monthly fee for a period of time as our success fee.
Got it. And how do you, without giving away your secret business source, Tony, how do you attract business?
We wish there was a secret source. We work really hard at marketing, and we don't believe we've cracked it in 30 years. What we are very fortunate to have is some wonderful introducers, people who refer business to us. Some of them are former customers, some of them are professionals, even some insolvency practitioners, and we hope we do a damn good job that make them look good for introducing us. Yeah.
Do you have a particular business area or sector focus, and are you UK only, or do you do the rest of the world?
Well, the fact of the matter is, I think it's pure arrogance to go abroad and think you can teach others to turn around companies. There'll be advisors and experts out there, in other parts of the world. However, we have been very fortunate to have done a fascinating job for a decent sized company in Kenya. We were basically introduced by Barclays Bank. I'm currently advising a NASDAQ listed, or a North European NASDAQ listed company in Sweden with subsidiaries in America, Sweden, Finland, and UK. That's quite an interesting job. But as a general rule, we stick to UK, and ideally, we shouldn't be traveling more than 2 hours from where we are anyway. So it's very much sort of, England, basically.
Yeah. And are there particular sectors or, sort of geographies or businesses that really attract you? Is it IT, construction, hospitality? Is there anything that sort of really stands out for you?
So I mean, the trite answer is we haven't done a financial institution, but in 30 odd years we've dealt with a lot of businesses. What we are aware of is that there are easier and more difficult businesses to turn around. We have a lot of experience, for instance, of the construction industry. So in the late 80s and 90s, we owned some businesses in the construction business. We still own some. It's a tough industry. We don't really want to be shareholders of building contractors. They do have a habit of going bust, and there is a reason for that, because they contractually they're always in a weak position. But there again, we for instance have a company that repairs concrete nationally. It started off as a waterproof concrete repair company. In fact, I was visiting one of our sites this morning, about 20 miles away. We install energy efficient materials in the construction industry. So we manufacture and install, although our style is very much more to outsource manufacturing now. But what we like is niche businesses. We like businesses that can justify their existence. They don't have a lot of competition. That's why we like technology. We like intellectual property, intangible assets, which could be know-how, it could be databases, it could be systems, that can justify their market, that make it a little bit more difficult for others to compete with. But in terms of who will help, we're generally on the side of the small company, and we're very pleased to help anyone. And because we don't charge up front, we're looking at success. We don't mind talking to people and giving them a bit of our time if that will help them, because to be fair, that's our marketing.
Yeah. You mentioned, I think earlier, I heard you said, well, we took over X, Y, Z company. That sounds a little bit more like you're an investor rather than an advisor. I mean, are you both, or you one or the other, or what are you?
So we use the skills and the knowledge of experienced turnaround people, insolvency practitioners. I mean, we personally think the best turnaround owners, managers are insolvency practitioners, or people who've really cut their teeth in insolvency, because you've got to, you can't take risks, because you're personally liable for those decisions. And there are one or two very successful investment firms that were set up and owned and run by insolvency practitioners. It's that ability to make those early decisions. John Moulton started off life as an insolvency practitioner, and he was a very successful investor. And as an inspiration, he was certainly someone I was very fortunate to meet and learn a lot from. And it's that sort of comfort with triage in business to get quickly to something that works that I think you need in order to do this, to invest in turnarounds.
Yeah.
Very different to normal investment.
Yes. And I think you mentioned you don't really like construction sort of contracting companies. Is there anything else that you just like, if you get a call from somebody in X business, you think, oh, don't really fancy this one?
So So we're happy to help construction companies. We just don't want to be shareholders.
Yeah.
So for instance, we recently, fairly recently, dealt with a large contracting company, but instead of basically closing it down and doing a carillon, which would have been horrendous, schools and hospitals would have had the problem of builders being left on, coming off site, scaffolding, lots of problems. What we did was the reason we didn't want to take shares in it is because builders, as a general rule, don't get credit and their customers don't give them business. However, this particular company was in the middle of long-term big contracts, a lot of them local authorities. So the strategy was to avoid essentially a formal insolvency. When we did a CVA basically on the back of the customers agreeing that they would fund the projects, front-end fund the projects. There would be no credit from the suppliers. It would be open book. The subcontractors and suppliers would be prepaid and to complete the projects. And it cost the customers more money. But what it did was it got jobs completed at significantly less than the cost of those jobs having to be re-let to new contractors. It got them completed in a time frame. It meant that schools could reopen, hospitals could open, or hospital wings could open. So it was a perfect use of an insolvency tool to protect the company. It couldn't have been done by an administrator because an administrator would not have wanted to take the risks, which is why it was a very unusual CVA to just run off an extra 2 years worth of work.
Yes.
For the benefit of creditors.
It does occur to me that in the area you are in, often banks have insisted on personal guarantees. Presumably you're always having to navigate that issue and the bank's just saying, well, just pay me.
Well, the interesting thing about personal guarantees is they are personal and they're not ours. So very often we're meeting directors of companies who have very often borrowed more money to avoid crystallizing a guarantee, but often inadvertently, in borrowing more money, entered into ever more guarantees. So for funding circle traditionally takes guarantees. A lot of the secondary lenders take guarantees. The invoice discounters will take guarantees. The banks will take guarantees. So, there's this sort of this perception of security where there's no way that the security, in particular the floating charge, will bite to pay out most secured lenders, but they will rely on the personal guarantee. So as an example, we bought a company 5-6 years ago where the owners had given personal guarantees to a lot of lenders. They had tried to turn around. They were in a CVA, an insolvency practitioner, but the reality was they hadn't come to terms with the fact that there was no way the company could support the debt. It was a zombie company. The debt wasn't justifiable. The CVA was continuing, but the problem is all the money was going to the lenders, and the lenders weren't actually, part of the CVA. So you can see it was just drowning the company in debt. So our line with the directors was, you're probably going to go bankrupt, but if we can save the business, you can keep your jobs, you can earn money, you can then fund your lives, survive. And we basically, in that particular case, we actually had to buy the business and assets, but we built the business or rebuilt the business. Actually, we closed the factory and outsourced the manufacturing, but that business 6 years later survives today. But the deal with the directors was, we'll help you. Now, as it turned out, we were able to help the directors do individual voluntary arrangements. Because the directors had jobs, they were able to service their IVAs, and because the business which wasn't owned by the former directors. They weren't directors. It was sufficiently successful for us to say to the directors, we would like to discuss with you and your supervisors the early termination of your IVAs, because we'd like you to come back into the company as directors, and we'd like to sort of cease being directors. So we helped use the company's money to buy out their IVAs. They are no longer in IVAs, and they are now running the company as directors. And they're rebuilding some of their shareholder prop through incentives. And they become shareholders the more dividends the company pays, basically, to us as the shareholders. So, that's an interesting use of us working with directors who've given personal guarantees. So back to my point at my beginning, we're here to help people, whereas I can understand the insolvency practitioner looking after the company has no interest in the directors. But we need their motivation, we needed their support to make the business work. So we're working in partnership normally with existing directors.
Got it. Now, you've given a couple of good examples of deals you've recently worked on. You made a bit of a stir, actually, which I was very impressed with your recent situation or project you were involved in, which involved a restructuring plan. And obviously, restructuring plans have generally been seen as relating to really big companies because there's a court process involved. It's quite a technical process, and yet you managed to use that process to compromise some HMRC debts. And I think it's probably the smallest company I'm aware of that has done that process. So I'd love to get your insight a little bit about that recent case study.
So since 2020, when HMRC regained its preferential status, becoming a secondary Crown preferential creditor, essentially in relation to deducted tax, the restructuring plan was introduced as a sort of a segue for the scheme of arrangement. I don't want to get technical on it, but the scheme of arrangement is essentially a capital reorganisation under the Companies Act that has been extended to allow for essentially a compromise of creditors, not just capital and shareholders. And so everyone has been talking about the notion of using a restructuring plan to basically compromise HMRC as a second preference creditor, because a CVA requires the preferential creditors to be paid in full before there's any money left for unsecured creditors. So it's always been talked about as the scope for compromising HMRC's claim as a second preference creditor, providing they were better off in a restructuring plan than the relevant alternative, which could be liquidation. But it would only work, I believe, if the CVA didn't pay them in full, and therefore the restructuring plan was only really relevant in very, very specific circumstances. And we've been talking about it, and I thought, I want to prove it can work. Now, in the meantime, the big restructuring plans, the latest main one being Thames Water, or a couple of retail ones, but they've been huge. The fees for Thames Water were 210 million, unbelievable. The fees for most of them have been very substantial, in the millions. And so what was really going on? And we found the case, and then it was really a question of, could it be done within realistic fees? And I realized that what happened is that most people doing a restructuring plan have started with the scheme of arrangement documentation and lawyers driving it, rather than what I'm CVA type documentation and turnaround people driving it. So we said, what we need to do is control the documentation, make it look a bit like a CVA, and make sure that it conforms to the restructuring plan legislation. And that's exactly what we did.
Yes. And it worked.
It worked.
Yes.
It worked. And we learned a lot along the way. Yes, there's a cost of 2 court hearings, but actually what we learned in particular was the benefit of speaking with creditors. What we're reading about, the Petrofac restructuring plan that was just rejected, last week by the court. It turned out that those who were driving it hadn't even spoken to some of the creditors, some of the major creditors. This whole consensual approach to speaking with creditors and engaging with them is critical to getting their support. Now, we were lucky in that because we'd engaged, no one challenged the restructuring plan in court.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the main people I would have been worried on your behalf to challenge as HMRC. How did you get them on board? Because I think when you just ring them up, frankly, HMRC might say, let's do we'll do a payment plan, but they never say, let's do a compromise. I mean, that's unheard of. So how did you manage to persuade them not to object?
Well, first of all, I think everyone in the restructuring world knows that restructuring plans are administered by the CVA unit. So the same unit that looks at company voluntary arrangements administers restructuring plans. And indeed, the email for them is the same. Now, again, speaking with them is very difficult because the advice on HMRC's website is if you've want to do a restructuring plan, you send a restructuring plan to the CVA team by email. You won't speak to them. The reality, however, is that you need to engage with them and you need to prove to the courts that you have engaged with them. And everyone complains, and this is the complaint, and this is the reason that most small restructuring plans have failed, is they sent the document to the email and nothing happened. Well, everyone also knows that if you send a CVA to the CVA team, you'll get a vote normally 48 hours before the actual creditors meeting. So they're organized to get there before a deadline, but not to be proactive. So we had to change the rules of the game, which is exactly what we did. We are, however, turnaround people. We didn't follow the rules. I actually wrote to the first permanent secretary, who is also chief executive of HMRC. I wrote to him, and therefore we had the trickle down correspondence and we had the trickle up correspondence, and the two came together. And I was very, very fortunate, I believe, in that HMRC engaged long before we went to court.
Fantastic. That's a great story. Well, we're moving to the end, so I'd like to know a little bit about the future. Currently, obviously, we're in a sort of low growth environment. Things are a little bit tough, whichever industry you're in, really. You're going to be busy. What are you going to be busy on, and what do you think the future will bring for you?
So busy is an interesting word because in the 90s, I was busy. After the millennium, when the markets collapsed, 2000, for a few years, I was busy. And everyone said after the great financial crisis, 2007-8, they're going to be busy. The insolvency world, the turnaround world, has not been busy since about 2005.
Yes.
And the reality is since, but beforehand, there was a lot of this concept of recycling of debt from bad businesses to new, better businesses, and writing off liabilities. Nowadays, no one wants to write off a liability, and so we've embraced this sort of extend and pretend. If you're a manager with lots of liabilities, you make sure you move on before they basically have to be written off. There is basically a dislike of writing off debt. Everyone wants to, and with low interest rates, the whole denial bit, the zombie company, has been preserved. Now, the increase in interest rates, it was thought, might actually crystallize a lot of defaults. The fact of the matter is there has been a lot of cleaning up in this background anyway. However, I believe we will not be busy until there is a major burst of the bubble. I think the burst of the bubble ultimately will come from when people who are owed money want to be repaid, and that might be 5-10 years away. But there is likely to be some event, but at the moment I can't see us being busy because there is no prospect of an event on the immediate horizon. Don't forget, central banks have been very good at smoothing things out. The banks have been very good at managing debt. No longer are they pushing companies over. I think a lot of the banks are very concerned about, losing control of their ability to get money from distressed businesses. They don't want to hand them over to insolvency practitioners. So I don't think we'll be busy. However, what we are happy to do is look at lots of small businesses with a view to, over time, building the portfolio.
Fantastic. Well, Tony, thank you very much for spending some time with us. I'm sure you'll probably get quite a few inquiries off the back of this, because I think you've really explained what you do very, very well. So I wish you and your team at K2 a lot of luck. And I don't think you're going to be quite as unbusy as you say. I think you'll find stuff to do. So thank you very much, Tony.
You're very welcome. And thank you very much for having me, Stephen.
Great to have you on.
You've been tuning in to the Turnaround podcast with your host, Stephen Phillips. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, freilibertas.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.